The instructor's boot pressed into Colette Adebayo's back, grinding her face into the mud of Fort Bragg's selection course. 14 hours without sleep, 12 miles with a 60-pound ruck. And now this. A man who outweighed her by 100 pounds, telling her she did not belong. But what the instructor did not know, what nobody in the special operations community knew, was that Colette had spent 7 years in a place far more dangerous than any battlefield. She had survived the night shift at a Louisiana truck stop diner. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you have worked a job where people underestimated you too. Get up, the instructor barked. The assessment cadre had been rotating through them for 3 days straight, searching for weakness, hunting for the moment each candidate would break. Colette pushed herself from the mud and stood at attention, her face expressionless despite the grit in her eyes and the fire in her lungs. Sergeant First Class Brant Hollister walked the line of remaining candidates, clipboard in hand. He was broad-shouldered with a shaved head and the kind of confidence that came from 2 decades in special operations. When he reached Colette, he stopped. His eyes moved to the clipboard, then back to her face. "Adebayo," he said, loud enough for the other candidates to hear. "Previous occupation listed here says waitress." He let the word hang in the air like an accusation. 7 years carrying plates and refilling coffee cups. He turned to the other candidates with a smirk. "Tell me, Adebayo, you think you could take my order right now? Maybe fetch me some eggs and toast." Laughter rippled through the exhausted candidates, desperate for any release from the pressure. Colette did not blink. She had heard worse from drunk truckers at 3 in the morning. She had been grabbed, cursed at, threatened with broken bottles. A man with a clipboard making jokes was nothing. "No, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady. "I am here to complete selection." Hollister leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "Then prove you belong here, waitress." The next evolution was a timed obstacle course followed by a land navigation exercise in full gear. Colette watched the other candidates, reading their body language the way she had learned to read customers who were about to cause trouble. The tall Ranger candidate on her left was favoring his right ankle. The former Marine 2 spots down kept touching his lower back. Small tells that instructors might miss, but that 7 years of survival in hostile territory had taught her to see. She completed the obstacle course in the top 5. During land navigation, she found her points while 3 candidates became hopelessly lost in the darkness. When dawn broke over Fort Bragg, the cadre assembled the remaining candidates for the announcement. 11 had started the final phase. 6 remained standing. Colette Adebayo was one of them. Hollister read the names of those advancing to the operator training course. When he reached hers, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Another tell. He had expected her to fail, had perhaps even designed portions of the assessment hoping she would. After dismissal, Colette walked toward the barracks alone. Her body screamed for rest, but her mind was already preparing for what came next. She paused at her bunk and pulled a small photograph from her rucksack. Her mother's face smiled back at her, taken 2 years before the cancer claimed her. "I made it through, Mama," she whispered. First step done. She did not notice Master Sergeant Darnell Okoye watching from across the barracks bay. The senior operator had seen something in her during the assessment, something that reminded him of the best soldiers he had ever served with. A stillness under pressure that could not be taught. Colette tucked the photograph away and began preparing her gear for the training course. She had earned nothing yet. Selection was just the beginning. The real test was the 6 months of training ahead, and she had just learned that Sergeant First Class Hollister had been assigned to the training cadre. The man who called her waitress would now control whether she passed or failed every evaluation. Colette allowed herself one small smile. She had handled worse customers than Brant Hollister. She had survived the night shift. The operator training course began 3 days later with a classroom briefing that felt more like a warning. Captain Teresa Vance stood at the front, her presence commanding despite her average height. She explained what the next 6 months would demand. Technical proficiency, tactical excellence, mental resilience beyond anything they had yet experienced. Colette absorbed every word while tracking the room from her peripheral vision. Hollister sat in the back corner with two other cadre members, watching the candidates like predators studying a herd. When his eyes landed on Colette, she felt the weight of his attention but refused to turn around. The first week established the pattern. Every candidate received difficult assignments, but Colette's assignments arrived with an extra edge. When others ran 5 miles before breakfast, she ran 7. When the class practiced close-quarters combat, Hollister paired her against the largest male candidate 3 sessions in a row. When night training required 4 hours of sleep, her firewatch shifts mysteriously doubled. Specialist Ricky Tran noticed it too, though his reaction was not sympathy. The young operator candidate had attached himself to Hollister's orbit, laughing at the senior instructor's jokes and echoing his disdain. During a weapons cleaning session, Tran sat beside 2 other candidates and spoke just loud enough for Colette to hear. "Heard she used to work at a Waffle House or something," Tran said. "Maybe she can make us pancakes when she washes out." The other candidates chuckled nervously. Colette continued cleaning her rifle, her hands steady, her face revealing nothing. She had heard variations of this mockery 1,000 times before. Different uniform, same insecurity dressed up as humor. But something else was happening during training that Hollister had not anticipated. The instructors responsible for tactical evaluation began noticing Colette's unusual gift. During a hostage rescue simulation, she identified the hidden threat actor before anyone else in her team. During a convoy ambush drill, she called out the secondary attack position that the cadre had concealed as an advanced test. "How did you see that?" one instructor asked after she located a camouflaged observer post that had fooled every previous candidate class. Colette considered her answer carefully. "The position was too perfect," she said. "Real concealment has small imperfections. That spot looked like someone wanted it to be invisible." The instructor exchanged a glance with Master Sergeant Okoye, who had been observing from the tree line. Neither spoke, but Colette caught the look. Another tell. That night in the barracks, the pressure finally found a release valve. One of the candidates, a former infantry sergeant named Wheeler, flopped onto his bunk and groaned loud enough to echo off the walls. "If Hollister makes me low crawl through one more mud pit, I'm going to request a transfer to the Navy. At least they have ships with showers." Another candidate threw a boot at him. "The Navy has standards, Wheeler. They would never take you." Laughter broke through the exhaustion, and for a moment the barracks felt almost human. Colette allowed herself a small smile from her corner bunk. These moments were familiar too. The late-night jokes between waitresses after a brutal dinner rush. The gallows humor that made impossible shifts survivable. Wheeler caught her eye and nodded. "Adebayo, you have been getting it worse than any of us. How are you still standing?" Colette shrugged. "I have had customers who were harder to deal with than Hollister." The barracks went quiet for a moment before Wheeler burst out laughing. "That might be the most terrifying thing anyone has said during this entire course." The next morning brought a land navigation evaluation in the worst terrain Fort Bragg had to offer. Dense forest, swamp crossings, and a time limit that required near-perfect execution. Colette moved through the course with efficiency, but something felt wrong. Her coordinates did not match the terrain. Either the map was outdated or someone had altered her assignment. She stopped at a creek crossing and studied the landscape. The checkpoint she needed should have been visible from this position. It was not. She pulled out her compass and ran the calculations again. The numbers were correct. The checkpoint simply was not where her orders indicated. Most candidates would have wasted precious time searching the wrong area. Colette recognized the signature of deliberate interference. She had seen it before when a diner manager tried to sabotage her hours to force her to quit. Instead of chasing the false location, she triangulated based on the terrain features that could not be faked and found the actual checkpoint 1,200 meters from where her coordinates indicated. She finished the course with 6 minutes to spare. Hollister was waiting at the finish point, his expression unreadable. Colette met his eyes without challenge or submission, simply acknowledgement that they both knew what had happened. After the evaluation concluded, Master Sergeant Okoye approached her near the equipment shed. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen combat in places that did not officially exist. "Adebayo," he said, "walk with me." They moved away from the other candidates until the evening sounds of Fort Bragg surrounded them. Crickets and distant vehicle engines, and the rhythm of a military installation settling into night. "Where did you learn to read situations like that?" Okoye asked. "And do not tell me it was infantry training, because we both know your file says you came from the civilian world." Colette was quiet for a long moment. 7 years working overnight shifts at a truck stop outside Baton Rouge, she finally said. "You learn to see trouble before it arrives, or you do not survive." Okoye nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he had already suspected. "There are operators with 15 years of experience who cannot read a room the way you do." Colette felt something loosen in her chest. Not pride exactly, but recognition. Someone finally seeing what she had carried alone for so long. "Final evaluation is in 2 weeks," Okoye continued. "Hollister will be grading your tactical assessment personally." He turned to face her directly. "Whatever he throws at you, remember that some of us are paying attention to more than just a scorecard." He walked away before she could respond, leaving Colette alone with the weight of what was coming. 2 weeks until the evaluation that would determine everything. 2 weeks with a man who wanted her to fail holding the power to make it happen. The final evaluation began at 0400 on a Thursday morning with no warning. Cadre pulled candidates from their bunks with flashlights and shouting, giving them 3 minutes to dress and assemble. Colette was ready in 2. She had slept in her boots for the past week, anticipating exactly this kind of chaos. Hollister stood at the assembly point with a tablet glowing in his hands. "Tonight you will execute a compound clearance operation against a fortified position." He read off team assignments, and Colette noted that she had been placed in charge of the smallest element with the most difficult approach vector. No coincidence there. The scenario was elaborate. A mock village constructed in the training area, complete with role players acting as civilians and opposing force members. Multiple buildings, overlapping sight lines, and intelligence that Colette immediately recognized as deliberately incomplete. Hollister had designed this scenario to create impossible choices. Any decision she made could be framed as wrong. Her team consisted of Wheeler and 2 candidates she barely knew. They gathered in the staging area while Colette studied the terrain model and briefing materials. Something was off. The intelligence indicated enemy positions in buildings 2 and 4, but the sight lines from those structures did not support mutual defense. No competent force would position themselves that way. "Adebayo," Wheeler whispered. "What are you thinking?" Colette traced her finger along the map. "The intel is wrong. Either intentionally or these positions are a feint." She tapped Building 6, which the briefing had marked as empty. "If I was defending this compound, I would put my main element here. Elevated position, clear fields of fire, covered withdrawal route." Wheeler studied the map and slowly nodded. "That is a big gamble if you are wrong." "I am not wrong." Captain Vance had positioned herself on the observation platform overlooking the training village. She watched through night vision as the 4 teams began their approach. 3 teams moved directly toward the positions indicated in their intelligence packages. Colette's team took a different route entirely. Hollister noticed immediately. He keyed his radio to the evaluation frequency. "Adebayo's element is deviating from the operations order. Recommend we flag this as a critical failure." Vance held up her hand. "Let play out." The first 3 teams hit their objectives and found nothing. Empty buildings where enemies should have been waiting. Confusion spread through the radio net as team leaders reported negative contact. Meanwhile, Colette's element had circled wide and approached Building 6 from its blind side. She hand-signaled her team into position. Through a dirty window, she could see the shapes of 4 opposing force members, exactly where she had predicted. They were watching the other teams stumble through empty buildings, waiting to spring their ambush. Colette gave the signal. Her team breached the door and cleared the room in 6 seconds. For enemy eliminated, no friendly casualties. The radio erupted with surprised chatter from the other teams. From the observation platform, Vance turned to Hollister. His jaw was tight, his tablet hanging forgotten at his side. She just identified a deception operation and neutralized the actual threat, while 3 other teams chased ghosts. Vance said quietly, "That is exactly the kind of thinking we need downrange." "She deviated from the operations order," Hollister replied, but his voice had lost its edge. "She adapted to reality instead of following flawed intelligence." Vance met his eyes. "Pass her." The evaluation concluded 2 hours later with all candidates assembled for results. Hollister read the names of those who had qualified. When he reached Colette's name, the word "pass" came out like it was being pulled from his throat with pliers. After dismissal, Hollister intercepted Colette near the barracks entrance. His face was controlled, but his eyes burned with something between anger and disbelief. "You got lucky tonight," he said. "One scenario does not prove anything. I have seen 100 candidates look good in training and fall apart when real bullets start flying." He stepped closer. "You might have fooled Captain Vance, but I know what you are. You're a Waitress playing soldier. And when we deploy together, I will be watching for the moment you prove me right." He walked away before she could respond. Colette stood in the darkness, her hands trembling slightly with the adrenaline that she had suppressed throughout the entire evaluation. She found Okoye sitting alone behind the equipment building, looking up at stars that the light pollution of the base could not fully hide. He gestured to the space beside him, and she sat down, her body finally registering the exhaustion she had been ignoring. "You heard about the evaluation," she said. "I heard you made Hollister look like a fool in front of the commanding officer." He allowed himself a small smile. Could not have happened to a more deserving man. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Okoye spoke again. "Can I ask you something personal? Why did you enlist? Most people with your observational skills end up in law enforcement or intelligence analysis. They do not volunteer for the hardest training the Army offers." Colette pulled out the photograph of her mother, now worn at the edges from handling. "My mother worked 3 jobs her whole life to keep us fed. Never complained, never made excuses. When she got sick, I promised her I would become something more than what our circumstances allowed." She paused, her voice catching slightly. "She died believing I was destined for something important. I was not going to let her be wrong." Okoye was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice carried its own weight of loss. "I had a sister, Adiz. She was killed in Lagos when I was 19, caught in violence she had nothing to do with. I joined the Army because I needed to believe I could protect people the way I could not protect her." Colette looked at him and saw the same quiet grief she carried in her own chest. 2 people shaped by loss, using that pain to forge something stronger. "The unit assignments are posting tomorrow," Okoye said. "Word is you're being assigned to my operational detachment." He met her eyes. "Hollister is on the same team." Colette absorbed this information without visible reaction. Of course he was. The universe had a sense of humor that way. "It also means you will be deploying to Syria in 6 weeks, Okoye continued. "Real missions, real consequences. Everything you have done until now has been preparation." He stood and offered her his hand. "Get some sleep, Adebayo. You earn it tonight." She took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles, and a man who had promised to watch her fail. But tonight she had proven something that no amount of mockery could take away. She was exactly where she was supposed to be. The pre-deployment workup brought Colette face to face with the team she would trust her life to in Syria. 12 operators assembled in the briefing room on the first morning, and she could feel the invisible lines already drawn. Hollister had been talking. Half the team regarded her with open skepticism, while the other half maintained careful neutrality. The workup schedule was brutal by design. For weeks of integrated training meant to transform individual operators into a cohesive unit. Live fire exercises, close quarters battle drills, communications protocols, and endless rehearsals for the types of missions they would execute downrange. Every day was an audition, and Colette knew that Hollister was waiting for her to stumble. She refused to give him the satisfaction. During a raid rehearsal on the second week, Colette noticed Tran making a critical error with his sector coverage. His positioning would leave a blind spot during entry, the kind of mistake that got people killed in real operations. She could have called out publicly, embarrassed him in front of the team and Hollister. Instead, she moved to his position during the reset and spoke quietly. Your angle is about 15 degrees too narrow. Shift left on entry and you will catch the corner that is currently dead space. Tran stared at her with suspicion, waiting for the mockery that usually accompanied correction. When none came, confusion replaced the suspicion. Why are you helping me? You know I've been running my mouth about you. Colette checked her weapon and prepared for the next iteration. Because when we were in Syria, your sector being wrong gets me killed. I would rather you learn now than have to attend your funeral later. She moved back to her position before he could respond. But something shifted in Tran's expression, a crack in the certainty that Hollister had built. The mission briefing came in the third week. Captain Vance stood before a wall of maps and photographs showing the operational area near Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. The region was a maze of competing factions, shifting alliances, and high-value targets moving through networks that changed daily. Our primary mission is direct action against leadership nodes, Vance explained. Secondary objectives include sensitive site exploitation and partnered operations with local forces. The environment is complex. Intelligence is often incomplete or contradictory. Success requires operators who can adapt faster than the enemy can react. Colette absorbed every detail, her mind automatically categorizing information the way she used to memorize complicated orders during dinner rush. Tribal affiliations, geographic choke points, known enemy tactics. The patterns were different from a truck stop diner, but pattern recognition itself was universal. She noticed movement at the back of the briefing room. A tall officer with silver eagles on his collar had entered quietly and taken a position against the wall. Colonel Marcus Whitfield. She recognized him from the command photographs in the headquarters building. His eyes swept the room, cataloging each operator, and when they reached Colette, they lingered for a moment longer than coincidence would explain. Something flickered across his face. Recognition, though Colette was certain they had never met. After the briefing concluded, Vance intercepted Colette in the hallway. The captain's expression was carefully neutral, the face of a commander about to deliver hard truth. Adebayo, you have shown potential that I do not see often. Your situational awareness is exceptional and your tactical instincts are sound. Vance paused, choosing her next words with precision. But potential means nothing downrange. The enemy does not care about your training scores or your evaluation reports. They only care about whether you make mistakes they can exploit. I understand, Captain. I'm not sure you do. Vance stepped closer, lowering her voice. Hollister has been in my ear since you were assigned to this team. He thinks you are a liability waiting to happen. I do not share his assessment, but I also cannot protect you from your own performance. When we deploy, you will need to prove yourself every single day. Not to me, not to Hollister, but to the operators whose lives depend on your decisions. Colette met her commander's eyes without flinching. I did not come this far to fail, Captain. Vance studied her for a long moment, then nodded. We will see. That night, Colette sat alone in the team room, surrounded by intelligence reports and operational summaries. She read everything she could find about their area of operations. Terrain analysis, cultural assessments, after-action reports from previous rotations. Her brain organized the information into patterns, connections that might matter when split-second decisions separated mission success from catastrophe. Okoye found her there after midnight, still reading by the dim light of a desk lamp. You should sleep, he said, settling into a chair across from her. Deployment is in 9 days. I will sleep on the plane. Colette set down the report she had been studying. Can I ask you something? Of course. Why do you believe in me? You barely know me, and most of this team thinks I'm a joke that Hollister has not finished telling yet. Okoye leaned back, his expression thoughtful. Because I have served with operators who came from every background you can imagine. West Point graduates and street kids from Detroit. Athletes and academics, and people who had nothing but determination. He paused. The ones who perform best under pressure are never the ones with the smoothest path. They're the ones who have already survived something that should have broken them. And you think that is me? I think anyone who spent 7 years handling hostile strangers at 3 in the morning while keeping a smile on her face has already proven she can function under conditions that would break most people. Okoye stood and moved toward the door. Combat is just a different kind of chaos, Adebayo, and you have been training for chaos your entire life. He left her alone with the intelligence reports and the weight of what was coming. 9 days until deployment. 9 days until theory became reality, and every lesson she had learned would be tested against an enemy who wanted her dead. Colette picked up the next report and continued reading. Sleep could wait. Preparation could not. Somewhere in Syria, targets were moving through the darkness, unaware that a former waitress from Louisiana was memorizing every detail of the world they thought they controlled. The C-17 touched down at the airfield outside Deir ez-Zor just after sunset, and Colette felt the weight of Syria settle over her like a second skin. The air was different here, dry and heavy with dust that seemed to carry the memory of every conflict this land had endured. She shouldered her gear and followed the team toward the convoy, waiting to transport them to the forward operating base. The FOB was a collection of hardened structures surrounded by concrete barriers and razor wire. Not comfortable, but defensible. Colette memorized the layout as they moved through the entry control point. Guard positions, sight lines, dead spaces. The patterns of security that would matter if this place ever came under attack. Their first mission came 48 hours later. A raid on a compound suspected of housing a mid-level commander in the enemy network. Staff Sergeant Morrison led the assault element, while Colette was assigned to the support team providing overwatch. A safe position for her first real operation, or so the planning assumed. The approach went smoothly. Morrison's element reached the compound walls without detection, and the breach was textbook. Colette watched through her optic as the team flowed into the target building, clearing rooms with the precision they had rehearsed 100 times at Fort Bragg. Then everything went wrong. Morrison's voice crackled over the radio, calm but urgent. Primary target not present. Structure is empty. Preparing to exfil. But Colette had seen something that Morrison missed. Movement in her peripheral vision, a shadow that did not match the pattern of the wind moving through the courtyard. She shifted her optic and felt her blood turn cold. 3 figures were positioning themselves on a rooftop 200 meters east of the compound. The glint of metal told her everything she needed to know. Ambush. The assault element would walk directly into a kill zone the moment they exited the building. Contact east, she called in her radio. Rooftop, 200 meters. 3 armed individuals preparing to engage. Tran was the closest member of the assault element to the eastern exit. He had already begun moving toward the door when Colette's warning came through. He froze, then threw himself backward just as gunfire erupted from the rooftop position. The round struck the doorframe where Tran had been standing a half-second earlier. The next 30 seconds were chaos. Return fire from the support element suppressed the rooftop position while Morrison redirected the assault team to an alternate exit. Colette kept her optic trained on the threat, calling adjustments as the enemy fighters attempted to reposition. When the team finally extracted to the vehicles, every operator was accounted for. No casualties. During the debrief, Morrison praised the team's response to the ambush. He mentioned the early warning that had prevented casualties, but did not specify where it came from. Hollister filled the gap with his own interpretation. Lucky spot, he said, his eyes fixed on Colette. Anyone with a decent optic would have seen them eventually. Colette said nothing. She had learned long ago that arguing with men like Hollister only gave them more ammunition. Later that night, she sat alone behind the communications building, her back against the concrete wall, and her eyes fixed on stars that looked exactly the same as they did in Louisiana. Her hands were trembling slightly, the delayed reaction to what had almost happened. Tran had been a half-second from death. If she had hesitated, if she had doubted what she saw, his family would be receiving a folded flag instead of phone call. The memory came without warning. A different night, a different kind of danger. The truck stop diner at 2 in the morning. Only 3 customers in the place. She had been refilling coffee when the door opened and a man walked in with his hand inside his jacket. Something about his movement was wrong. The way his eyes swept the room without really seeing it. The way his weight shifted forward onto his toes. Colette had recognized the signs of a man preparing to do violence. She had seen it before in drunk truckers and angry boyfriends and desperate people pushed past their limits. But this was different. This man was not angry. He was terrified. She had approached him slowly, coffee pot in hand, and spoken in the calm voice she used for customers having the worst nights of their lives. She had asked him if he wanted to sit down, asked if he was hungry, asked if there was someone she could call for him. The gun had come out eventually, shaking in his grip while he demanded money from the register. But Colette kept talking, kept treating him like a human being instead of a threat. She asked his name, asked about his kids, the photos she could see in his wallet when he pulled it out by mistake instead of a weapon. 20 minutes later, he was sitting in a booth, crying into a cup of coffee, while she called his sister to come pick him up. The gun was on the table between them, unloaded, harmless. 5 customers and the cook had watched a robbery become a rescue, and none of them ever knew how close they had come to dying. That night had taught Colette something that no training could replicate. The tells that preceded violence. The micro-expressions and body mechanics that revealed intent before action. She had spent the next 4 years refining that awareness, and tonight it had saved Tran's life. Footsteps approached in the darkness. Okoye settled against the wall beside her, close enough to talk, but not close enough to crowd. "You saw them before anyone else," he said. "That was not luck. That was the thing I told you about. The thing you learned in that diner." Colette nodded slowly. "I spent years watching people decide whether to hurt me. You learn to see the moment before it happens." Okoye was quiet for a moment. "The team needs that, Adebayo. Do not let Hollister convince you to hide what you can do." Before Colette could respond, her radio crackled with Captain Vance's voice. "All personnel report to the briefing room. Immediate tasking." They moved together through the darkness toward the lighted building where the rest of the team was assembling. Inside, Vance stood before a map with fresh markings indicating a new target compound. "Intelligence just confirmed a high-value target at this location. We are launching in 2 hours." Vance paused, her expression grim. "Staff Sergeant Morrison took shrapnel during the ambush. Minor wound, but he is out of action for at least a week." The room absorbed this information in silence. Morrison had been their primary assault element leader. His absence left a vacuum that someone would need to fill. Vance turned to face the team directly. "I need a new element leader for this operation." Her eyes moved across the assembled operators and stopped on Colette. "Adebayo, you have the best situational awareness I have seen in 15 years. The job is yours if you want it." The silence that followed was deafening. Hollister's face went pale with barely contained fury. Colette felt every eye in the room fixed on her, waiting for her answer. She thought about her mother's voice, telling her she was destined for something important. "Yes, Captain," she said. "I will lead the element." The briefing room fell into a silence, so complete that Colette could hear the generator humming outside. Every operator processed what had just happened. Captain Vance had chosen a former waitress with 0 combat leadership experience over Sergeant First Class Brant Hollister, a man with 2 decades in special operations and more deployments than most of the team combined. Hollister's face cycled through emotions too quickly to catalog. Disbelief, fury, humiliation. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a moment Colette thought he might actually refuse the assignment. But 20 years of military discipline held. He was a professional, whatever else he might be, and professionals did not openly defy their commanding officers. "Captain," Hollister said through a jaw so tight the words barely escaped. "Understood." Vance held his gaze for a long moment, a silent communication passing between them that Colette could not read. Then she turned back to the map and began outlining the operation. The target was a compound 12 kilometers northeast of their position. Intelligence indicated a regional commander responsible for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The window for action was narrow. 6 hours until the target was expected to relocate, which meant launching before dawn with minimal planning time. Adebayo, Vance said, "You have 90 minutes to brief your element. Make them count." Colette gathered her team in a smaller room adjacent to the main briefing area. Hollister, Tran, Wheeler, and 2 operators named Kowalski and Dubois. 5 men who would either follow her into that compound or watch her fail. She could feel Hollister's hostility radiating like heat from a furnace, but she pushed it aside. There would be time for politics later. Right now, there was only the mission. She spread the imagery and intelligence reports across the table and began talking. Every detail she had memorized during those long nights at Fort Bragg came flowing out. Terrain features, approach vectors, known enemy defensive patterns in this region, tribal affiliations that might influence the target's behavior. She walked them through the compound layout, identifying likely positions for guards based on the architecture and sightlines. The team listened in silence. Even Hollister's expression shifted from contempt to something closer to grudging attention as she demonstrated a command of the operational picture that exceeded what most leaders brought to their first mission. Questions Colette asked when she finished. Wheeler raised his hand. "What is our contingency if the target has already moved?" "We shift to sensitive site exploitation." Colette pointed to a secondary structure in the compound imagery. "Intelligence indicates this building may contain communications equipment. Even if we miss the target, we can potentially compromise his network." Tran leaned forward. "And if we encounter heavier resistance than expected? We have overwatch position here and here." Colette indicated 2 elevated positions on the map. "If things go wrong, we collapse to a defensible position and call for extract. No heroics. Everyone comes home." She looked around the table, meeting each operator's eyes in turn. When she reached Hollister, she held his gaze without challenge or submission. "Any other questions?" Hollister said nothing. His silence was answer enough. The insertion went smoothly. 2 vehicles dropped them a kilometer from the compound, and the team moved through the darkness in a formation that Colette had adjusted based on the terrain. She led from the front, her senses tuned to every shadow and sound that the Syrian night produced. They reached the compound perimeter, and Colette called a halt. Something was wrong. The guard positions she had identified in the intelligence imagery were empty. Either the target had already fled, or this was a trap. She signaled for the team to hold while she studied the compound through her night vision. Movement in her peripheral vision. A flicker of heat that did not match the ambient temperature of the stone walls. There, a concealed position near the main entrance that had not appeared in any of the imagery. She hand-signaled the information to her team. Modified approach. New entry point. The operators adjusted without hesitation, flowing around the hidden threat and entering through a secondary breach point that Colette had identified during her briefing. The clearance was violent and fast. 3 enemy fighters in the main building, neutralized before they could raise an alarm. The regional commander was exactly where intelligence had predicted, surrounded by documents and communications equipment that would keep the analysts busy for weeks. Target secured, Colette called over the radio. Preparing for exfil. The extraction was clean. No casualties. No complications. The entire operation had lasted 11 minutes from breach to departure, and every member of her element was returning to base alive. During the helicopter ride back to the FOB, Colette allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what had just happened. Her first mission as element leader. Her first combat command. 0 casualties. She looked across the cabin at her team. Wheeler gave her a small nod of respect. Tran's expression had shifted from skepticism to something that looked almost like admiration. Kowalski and Dubois exchanged glances that communicated more than words could. Only Hollister remained unchanged, his face a mask of professional neutrality that revealed nothing of what churned beneath. The debrief was brief. Captain Vance reviewed the operation, noted the successful adaptation to unexpected conditions, and formally logged Mission 1 under Adebayo's command as a success. After the others filed out, Vance caught Colette's arm. "That concealed position you identified. It was not in any of our intelligence products. How did you see it? Colette considered her answer. The shadows were wrong, Captain. Someone had disturbed the natural fall of light near that wall. It is the kind of thing you notice when you've spent years watching for people who want to hurt you. Vance studied her for a long moment. 30 more missions in this deployment, Adebayo. I expect the same results. Yes, Captain. Colette walked out into the Syrian dawn, the weight of command settling onto her shoulders like armor she had not known she was built to wear. Behind her, Hollister watched from the doorway of the briefing room. His expression was unreadable, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. One mission down, 30 to go, and somewhere in the back of her mind, her mother's voice whispered that she had always known this day would come. Mission 2 came 3 days later. A compound clearance that turned into a running firefight through narrow streets when the target attempted to flee. Colette read the escape route before the target chose it, positioning Tran and Wheeler to intercept. Target captured. 0 casualties. Mission 3 was a vehicle interdiction on a desert road at midnight. Intelligence suggested the convoy carried weapons. Colette noticed the lead driver's body language through the thermal scope, the rigid posture of someone expecting violence. She called for a different approach, surrounding the convoy before it could react. The weapons cache was larger than anyone expected. 0 casualties. Mission 4. Mission 5. Mission 6. Each operation brought new variables, new dangers, new moments where Colette's ability to read situations before they unfolded kept her team alive. Word began spreading through the FOB. Other element leaders started asking about her methods. Intelligence officers requested her input on target analysis. Hollister watched it all with the expression of a man being slowly poisoned. He executed every order with professional precision, never giving Colette grounds for formal complaint. But the contempt in his eyes had been replaced by something more complex. Confusion, perhaps. The foundations of his worldview cracking under the weight of evidence he could not dismiss. Mission 7 nearly broke the streak. The target compound was larger than previous objectives, a multi-building complex that required splitting the element into 2 teams. Colette led one team, while Hollister led the other, their first operation working semi-independently. The breach went smoothly, but during clearance Colette's team encountered a room they had not anticipated. 6 enemy fighters, armed and alert, positioned behind reinforced cover. A kill box designed to shred anyone who entered. Colette processed the geometry in a fraction of a second. Direct assault meant casualties. Retreat meant losing the element of surprise across the entire compound. She needed a third option. She noticed one of the fighters, the youngest, barely more than a teenager. His weapon was shaking. His eyes kept darting toward the door behind him rather than toward the threat in front of him. She recognized the look. Terrified. Trapped. Fighting because he saw no other choice. The memory surfaced unbidden. A truck stop diner in Louisiana, 2 in the morning, the bell over the door chiming as a man walked in with death in his eyes. She had been 17 years old, alone behind the counter because the night manager had called in sick. 5 customers scattered across the booths. A cook in the back who was half-deaf from years of working the grill. The man's hand was inside his jacket, gripping something that Colette knew was a weapon before she ever saw it. But she also saw the tremor in his shoulders. The way his breath came too fast. The wedding ring on his finger and the photograph of children visible in his wallet when he fumbled it for his pocket. She had walked toward him while the other customers froze. Kept her voice calm and soft, the voice she used for crying babies and heartbroken truckers and everyone else who stumbled into her diner, carrying more pain than they could hold. She asked his name. Raymond. She asked about his children. A boy and a girl, 7 and 4. She asked what had brought him to this place at this hour with that look in his eyes. The gun came out eventually. He waved it at the register, at the customers, at Colette herself. But she kept talking. Kept seeing Raymond instead of the weapon, kept treating him like the human being he was underneath the desperation. 20 minutes later the gun was on the table between them, unloaded, and Raymond was sobbing into a cup of coffee while Colette held his hand and waited for his sister to arrive. The police came afterward, quiet and professional, and they told Colette she had saved 6 lives that night, including Raymond's. She had carried that lesson ever since. Fear looked the same everywhere, and sometimes the most dangerous situations could be defused by simply seeing the person behind the threat. In the Syrian compound, Colette made a decision that violated every tactical principle she had been taught. Hold fire, she called her team. Then she stepped into the open, her weapon lowered, her eyes fixed on the terrified young fighter. She spoke in Arabic, the phrases she had memorized during those long nights of preparation. I see that you are afraid. You do not want to die here. Neither do I. Put down your weapons, and I promise you will live. The young fighter's weapon shook harder. The other enemy combatants exchanged uncertain glances, their resolve wavering in the face of behavior they had not expected. Colette kept talking, kept her voice calm, kept seeing the human beings behind the guns. 30 seconds later, 6 weapons clattered to the floor. The fighters knelt with their hands raised, and Colette's team secured them without firing a single shot. During the exfil, Tran moved close enough to speak privately. That was insane, he said. His voice carried no criticism, only wonder. How did you know they would surrender? I did not know, Colette admitted, but I recognized the fear. Sometimes people fight because they think they have no choice. Give them a choice, and they take it. The story spread through the FOB within hours. 6 enemy fighters captured without a shot fired. By mission 10, Colette's reputation had become something larger than herself. Okoye found her in the Chow Hall after the debrief, surrounded by operators who had once viewed her with suspicion. They were laughing at something Wheeler had said, the easy camaraderie of people who had bled together and trusted each other with their lives. Colette sat among them, finally belonging in a way she had not experienced since leaving Louisiana. Okoye waited until the others dispersed before taking the seat across from her. They're calling you something, he said. The other teams, the intelligence officers, even some of the coalition partners. Colette raised an eyebrow. Were they calling me? Okoye smiled, a rare expression that transformed his usually serious face. They say you see what cannot be seen, that you read the battlefield like other people read books. He leaned forward. 10 missions at Abayo. 0 casualties. Do you understand how extraordinary that is? Colette thought about Raymond in the truck stop, about the young fighter in the compound, about every moment where seeing the human beneath the threat had saved lives. I understand that we're only halfway through this deployment, she said. 21 missions to go. Plenty of time for everything to go wrong. Okoye nodded slowly. Fair enough. But for what it is worth, Hollister has stopped making jokes about waitresses. I think he is starting to realize that he underestimated you. Colette glanced across the Chow Hall to where Hollister sat alone, his food untouched, his eyes fixed on something only he could see. Maybe, she said, or maybe he is just waiting for me to fail. Either way, Okoye replied, you have 21 more chances to prove him wrong. The targets became harder as the deployment progressed. Missions 11 through 15 took Colette's element deeper into hostile territory, pursuing commanders who had learned to fear the coalition's reach. The enemy adapted. Security increased. Escape routes became more sophisticated. But Colette adapted faster. Mission 12 was a near disaster that her instincts transformed into a triumph. Mission 14 required her team to hold a position for 6 hours while extraction assets were rerouted. Mission 15 put them in a firefight that lasted 45 minutes and consumed nearly all their ammunition. 0 casualties. Every time. But something else was happening across the FOB that Colette could not ignore. Other units were experiencing failures at an alarming rate. Operations that should have succeeded were meeting prepared defenses. Targets were relocating hours before raids. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. She brought her concerns to Captain Vance after Mission 16. Someone is leaking information, Colette said. She had spread a map across the table, marked with the locations and timings of failed operations. Look at the pattern. Every compromised mission involved intelligence that passed through the Joint Coordination Center. The targets that we hit independently, using only our organic intelligence, those succeed. The ones that touch the larger network fail. Vance studied the map with growing unease. This is a serious accusation, Adebayo. I know, but the pattern is clear. Colette pointed to a cluster of failed operations. These 3 missions all shared intelligence with the same coalition partner unit. That cannot be random. Hollister had entered the briefing room during their conversation. He looked at the map and shook his head. This is paranoia, he said. Failed missions happen. The enemy gets lucky sometimes. You cannot build a conspiracy theory out of coincidence. Colette met his eyes without flinching. When I worked at the diner, I tracked over 200 regular customers. Their orders, their schedules, their habits. I knew when someone was going to cause trouble before they walked through the door because I recognized the patterns. She tapped the map. This is the same thing. Someone in the coalition network is feeding information to the enemy. Vance looked between them, weighing the arguments. I will flag this for counterintelligence review. In the meantime, we restrict our operational planning to internal channels only. Hollister's expression made clear what he thought of that decision, but he said nothing. 3 days later, counterintelligence identified a translator in the partner unit who had been passing information to enemy contacts. The leak was sealed. Failed operations across the theater dropped by 60% overnight. Vance found Colette after the announcement. Your pattern analysis probably saved dozens of lives. I have recommended you for a commendation. Colette nodded, but her attention had been caught by something else. A familiar figure had arrived at the FOB that morning. Colonel Marcus Whitfield stood near the command building, ostensibly reviewing operations with the base commander. But his eyes kept drifting toward Colette with that same strange intensity she had noticed at Fort Bragg. After the briefing concluded, Vance approached Whitfield. Colette watched from a distance as they spoke, too far to hear, but close enough to read body language. Vance gestured toward Colette. Whitfield nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. What was a colonel from Fort Bragg doing in Syria? And why did he keep watching her like she was a ghost he recognized but could not name? The questions would have to wait. Mission 18 was briefed that evening, and it would be the most dangerous operation of the deployment. The target was a senior commander responsible for coordinating attacks across 3 provinces. Intelligence placed him in a compound at the center of a hostile village, surrounded by fighters loyal enough to die for him. The approach would require moving through territory where every civilian might be an enemy spotter and every building might conceal an ambush. Colette briefed her team with the calm precision that had become her signature. Contingencies for every scenario. Alternate routes memorized. Rally points established. By the time they loaded into the vehicles, every operator understood both the plan and the principles that would guide adaptation when the plan inevitably changed. The approach went wrong within the first kilometer. Enemy fighters had established checkpoints that the intelligence had not predicted. Colette rerouted twice, then a third time, threading her team through gaps in the defensive network that existed for only minutes before closing. By the time they reached the target compound, they had already evaded 4 separate contact situations. The breach was clean. The clearance was textbook. The target was secured along with a cache of documents that would fuel intelligence operations for months. Then the extraction route collapsed. Enemy reinforcements flooded the village from 3 directions simultaneously. The planned exfil was cut off. The alternate route was compromised. Colette's team was surrounded in a compound with limited ammunition and no clear path to safety. She studied the tactical situation with a focus that had carried her through 1,000 impossible shifts at the diner. 3 enemies closing. 1 team. Limited resources. There had to be an option that nobody else could see. She found it in the architecture. The compound shared a wall with a structure that intelligence had marked as a mosque. Enemy fighters would not fire into it, and they would not expect coalition forces to use it as an escape route. It was culturally unthinkable. We go through the mosque, Colette announced. Hollister's head snapped toward her. That is insane. The political fallout alone would end careers. The political fallout requires us to be alive to experience it. Colette was already moving. We enter respectfully. We exit quickly. We cause no damage. The alternative is dying in this compound. She did not wait for agreement. She breached the connecting wall and led her team through the sacred space with the reverence of someone who understood that survival sometimes required impossible choices. They moved through the building in silence, emerging on the far side into an alley that the enemy had not thought to cover. 12 minutes later, the entire element reached the extraction point. Target secured. Documents recovered. 0 casualties. On the helicopter back to base, Colette felt the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. 18 missions. 18 times she had brought everyone home. 11 more to go. Across the cabin, Hollister sat with his head bowed. When he finally looked up, his expression held something Colette had never seen from him before. Respect. He did not speak. He did not need to. Some acknowledgments transcended words. The debrief included news that shifted everything. Intelligence had identified a gathering of senior enemy leadership scheduled for the following week. Multiple high-value targets in one location. The operation would be the largest and most dangerous of the deployment. Captain Vance looked directly at Colette. I want you leading the primary assault element. This is the mission that justifies everything we have done here. Colette thought about her mother, about Raymond, about every moment that had led to this place. I understand, Captain. We will be ready. Missions 19 through 24 blurred together in a rhythm of planning, execution, and survival. Colette led her element through compound clearances, vehicle interdictions, and partnered operations with local forces who had begun requesting her team specifically. Her reputation had grown beyond the FOB, beyond the theater, reaching ears at commands she would never visit. 24 missions. 0 casualties. The numbers had become a kind of legend. Mission 25 tested a different aspect of her leadership. The target was a weapons facilitator operating from a building adjacent to a school. Children were present during the operational window. Colette spent 14 hours redesigning the approach to ensure no collateral damage, then executed a precision raid that captured the target without a single civilian injury. Mission 26 required ferocity. An ambush during extraction left her team pinned in a wadi with enemy fighters closing from 3 directions. Colette directed fire with cold precision, eliminating threats with an efficiency that reminded her operators she was not merely a diplomat in combat gear. When the dust settled, 8 enemy fighters were dead and her team was intact. Mission 27, 28, 29. Each operation added another layer to the story of Staff Sergeant Colette Adebayo, the former waitress who had become something unprecedented in special operations history. Between missions, Colette noticed a change in Hollister. The man who had tormented her since selection had grown quieter, more withdrawn. He executed orders with the same professional precision, but something behind his eyes had dimmed. She learned the reason from Wheeler, who had overheard a satellite phone call that Hollister had not known was audible. His wife filed for divorce, Wheeler said quietly. Apparently, she has been seeing someone else for over a year. She is taking the kids back to her parents in Ohio. Colette absorbed this information without comment. She had every reason to feel satisfaction at Hollister's suffering. He had mocked her, sabotaged her, tried to destroy her career before it began. Justice would be watching him crumble while she thrived. But that was not who she was. That was not who her mother had raised her to be. She found Hollister that evening behind the vehicle maintenance bay, sitting alone on an ammunition crate with a satellite phone clutched in his hands. His shoulders were hunched in a posture she recognized from 1,000 broken customers who had stumbled into her diner, carrying grief too heavy to hold. Colette sat down on a crate nearby, close enough to acknowledge his presence, but far enough to give him space. They sat in silence for several minutes. The Syrian night wrapped around them, indifferent to human pain. I spent 22 years putting the mission first, Hollister finally said. His voice was hollow, stripped of the confidence that had defined him. Missed birthdays, anniversaries, school plays. I told myself it mattered, that I was protecting something worth protecting. He looked down at the phone. She said she stopped loving me 3 years ago. I did not even notice. Colette said nothing. Some pain did not need words. It needed witness. You must think this is funny, Hollister continued. The man who tried to break you, broken himself. No, Colette said quietly. I think this is tragedy. A man who gave everything for his country, discovering that everything was not enough to keep what he loved. Hollister looked at her with an expression she had never seen from him. Confusion, vulnerability, the faintest edge of something that might have been shame. Why are you being kind to me? I have done nothing to deserve it. Colette thought about Raymond in the truck stop, about every desperate soul she had talked down from the edge of violence. Because kindness is not about deserving. It is about recognizing that everyone carries pain they did not choose. She stood and looked down at him. I am not your enemy, Hollister. I never was. She walked away before he could respond, leaving him alone with his grief and the first crack in the wall he had built between them. Mission 30 came 4 days later. The target was a communications hub that coordinated enemy movements across 3 provinces. The compound was heavily defended, requiring a multi-element assault with precise timing. Colette led the primary breach, while Hollister commanded the support element covering their flank. The initial clearance went smoothly. Colette's team moved through the structure with practiced efficiency, neutralizing threats and securing equipment. They were preparing to exfil when everything collapsed. A hidden basement. Fighters who had remained concealed during the initial sweep. They emerged behind Hollister's position, catching his element in a crossfire that should have been impossible. Colette heard the gunfire through her radio and made an instant assessment. Hollister's position was compromised. His element was taking fire from an angle they could not address without exposing themselves to the primary threat. In approximately 8 seconds, enemy fighters would have a clear shot at Hollister himself. She could let it happen. One moment of hesitation, one delayed response, and the man who had tormented her would be gone. No one would question it. Combat was chaos. People died. Colette was moving before the thought fully formed. She burst from cover and sprinted across open ground that enemy fire had transformed into a kill zone. Rounds snapped past her head as she closed the distance to Hollister's position. She saw the fighter who had drawn a bead on him, saw the muzzle flash beginning, and threw herself into Hollister's body with enough force to knock them both to the ground. The bullet meant for his chest passed through the space where he had been standing a half-second earlier. Colette rolled, acquired the target, and fired twice. The enemy fighter dropped. The rest of the engagement lasted another 90 seconds. When silence finally fell, Colette's team had secured the compound and eliminated all threats. 0 casualties. Hollister lay on his back, staring at the sky, processing what had just happened. The woman he had mocked, sabotaged, and dismissed had just risked her life to save his. Colette offered him her hand. On your feet, Sergeant. We still have to exfil. He took her hand and let her pull him up. For a long moment, they stood face to face amid the debris of combat. Why, he asked. His voice cracked on the word. Colette met his eyes with the same calm she had carried through 30 missions. Because every life on my team is my responsibility, including yours. She turned and began organizing the extraction, leaving Hollister standing in the ruins of everything he thought he knew about her. The debrief that night confirmed what everyone already sensed. Mission 31 would launch in 48 hours. The gathering of senior enemy leadership, the largest operation of a deployment. The mission that would define Colette's legacy. Vance laid out the intelligence with grim precision. Multiple high-value targets. Heavy defenses. The highest risk they had faced in 14 months. This is the one that matters, Vance said. Everything we have done has led to this moment. Colette looked around the room at her team. Wheeler, Tran, Kowalski, Dubois, and Hollister, who met her gaze with something that had not existed between them before. Trust. We will be ready, Colette said. All of us. Mission 31 launched at 0200 under a moonless Syrian sky. The target compound sprawled across 3 acres of fortified terrain, housing the largest gathering of enemy leadership the coalition had identified in 2 years. Intelligence confirmed at least 6 high-value targets present, protected by an estimated 40 fighters who had transformed the location into a fortress. Colette led the primary assault element. Hollister commanded the support element. 2 additional teams from partner units would establish a cordon to prevent escape. Overhead, drone feeds provided real-time surveillance that Colette monitored through a tablet mounted on her forearm. The approach took 90 minutes of careful movement through hostile territory. Colette read the landscape the way she had once read a crowded diner on a Saturday night, tracking every variable, anticipating every potential disruption. Twice she halted the advance when something in the environment felt wrong, both times avoiding detection by roving patrols. They reached the assault position at 03:45. Colette studied the drone feed, watching the patterns of movement inside the compound. Guards rotated on predictable schedules. Leadership figures moved between buildings with entourages that revealed their importance. She cataloged each detail, building a mental map of how the operation would unfold. Then she saw something that changed everything. The enemy commander, their primary target, had positioned himself in a building at the center of the compound. But his body language was wrong. He kept glancing toward the eastern wall, kept checking his watch, kept speaking to subordinates with the hurried intensity of someone expecting something to happen. "He knows we are coming," Colette said in her radio. "He is preparing to evacuate east. All elements adjust. We breach in 60 seconds, not 5 minutes." The acceleration caught everyone off guard, but 14 months of working together had forged her team into something that operated on instinct. The breach came fast and violent, catching the enemy mid-preparation rather than fully fortified. Colette moved through the compound with the focused intensity she had developed over 30 missions. Room clearance became a rhythm, each operator flowing around the others like components of a single organism. Threats appeared and disappeared with the efficiency of a choreographed performance. But the enemy commander had not survived this long by being predictable. An explosion rocked the eastern building just as Colette's team approached. A tunnel. The commander had prepared an escape route that intelligence had not identified. He was running. Colette made an instant decision. She redirected Tran and Wheeler to secure the primary building while she pursued the commander with Kowalski and Dubois. The tunnel emerged 200 meters outside the compound perimeter, exactly where the cordon teams had not established coverage. She burst from the tunnel exit into a dry riverbed where the commander and 3 bodyguards were scrambling toward a waiting vehicle. The commander saw her and raised his weapon, but Colette had already read his intention in the tension of his shoulders, the angle of his hips, the direction his eyes flickered before his hands moved. She fired twice before he could complete his draw. The commander fell. His bodyguards hesitated, the split-second uncertainty of men who had just watched their leader die. That hesitation was enough. Kowalski and Dubois neutralized them before they could recover. Primary target down. Colette called into her radio. Continuing clearance. The next 20 minutes were controlled chaos. Colette managed the operation the way she had once managed impossible dinner rushes, tracking multiple variables simultaneously, issuing adjustments in real time, ensuring that every element had what it needed to succeed. When a partner unit encountered unexpected resistance, she redirected Hollister's element to support them. When the cordon reported a potential breach, she dispatched Wheeler to reinforce. Every decision flowed from the same instinct that had kept her alive in truck stops where violence could erupt without warning. See the whole picture. Anticipate the next problem. Keep everyone moving toward the exit. The final clearance came at 0432. 6 high-value targets eliminated or captured. The enemy communications network crippled. A document cache that would fuel intelligence operations for years. Colette assembled her team for extraction and conducted a head count that she already knew would come back complete. 31 missions, 0 casualties, a record that had seemed impossible when she accepted her first command. The helicopter ride back to the FOB was silent. Exhaustion had claimed her operators, but beneath the fatigue was something else. Relief. The quiet satisfaction of professionals who had accomplished something extraordinary. Dawn was breaking over the FOB when they landed. Word had already spread. Other teams lined the path from the helicopter pad to the operations center, offering nods and handshakes as Colette's element passed. The former waitress who had become something unprecedented in special operations history. The debrief was thorough but brief. Captain Vance recorded the operational details with the efficiency of someone who understood that her people needed rest more than they needed bureaucracy. Outstanding work, Vance said when the formal portion concluded. All of you. She looked directly at Colette. Especially you, Staff Sergeant. What you have accomplished on this deployment will be studied for years. Colette nodded, too tired for words. The team dispersed to barracks and showers and the small comforts that followed survival. Colette found herself alone outside the operations center, watching the Syrian sunrise paint the sky in colors that reminded her of Louisiana. Footsteps approached. She did not need to turn to know who it was. Hollister stopped beside her, his presence no longer carrying the hostility that had defined their relationship for so long. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the dawn. I was wrong about you. The words came out rough, as if they had been dragged from somewhere deep inside him. Colette turned to face him. Hollister met her eyes with an expression stripped of pretense. From the first day at selection, I looked at you and saw someone who did not belong. A waitress playing soldier. He paused, gathering himself. I was so certain that I knew what qualified someone for this work. Background, pedigree, years of training. He shook his head slowly. I never considered that someone could learn everything that matters in a truck stop diner. Colette studied the man who had been her tormentor, now standing before her with something like humility. You are not entirely wrong, she said. I did not belong, not according to any standard that existed before I arrived. She looked back at the sunrise. But maybe the standards were incomplete. Hollister was quiet for a long moment. You saved my life on Mission 30. I never thank you for that. You would have done the same for me. He nodded slowly. I would have. That is how I know how much has changed. They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun cleared the horizon. Behind them, the FOB was waking to a new day, the last day of a deployment that had transformed them both. We go home next week, Hollister said finally. What happens when you get back? Colette thought about Fort Bragg, about the recognition that would inevitably follow, about the future that had opened before her. I do not know, she admitted, but I know I will be ready for whatever comes next. Hollister extended his hand. For what it is worth, I'm glad you proved me wrong. Colette took his hand and shook it firmly. For what it is worth, I am glad you finally noticed. Fort Bragg looked different when Colette stepped off the transport plane. The same buildings, the same training fields, the same pine trees lining the roads she had run during selection. But she was not the same person who had left 14 months earlier. Word of her record had preceded her return. 31 missions, 0 casualties. The story had spread through Special Operations Command like wildfire, growing with each retelling until the former waitress from Louisiana had become something approaching legend. Colette found the attention uncomfortable. She had not led those missions for recognition. She had led them because lives depended on her decisions, and every life on her team was sacred. The commendations and congratulations felt like they belonged to someone else. Reintegration took 3 weeks. Medical evaluations, psychological screenings, administrative processing. The machinery of the military grinding through its requirements before releasing its people back to normal duty. Colette endured it with the patience she had developed over 7 years of difficult customers and 14 months of combat. On the 4th day back, she received a summons that set her nerves on edge. Colonel Marcus Whitfield requested her presence at his office. No explanation, no context, just an order that carried the weight of rank she could not refuse. Colette presented herself at the appointed time, her uniform immaculate, her bearing professional. Whitfield's aide escorted her into an office lined with photographs and memorabilia from a career spanning 4 decades of service. The colonel stood at his window, looking out at the base that had been his home for longer than Colette had been alive. When he turned, his expression held none of the professional distance she had expected. Please sit, Staff Sergeant. He gestured to a chair across from his desk. What I have to tell you is long overdue. Colette sat, her hands folded in her lap, her instincts telling her that something significant was about to unfold. Whitfield lowered himself into his chair with the careful movement of a man whose body carried the accumulated damage of decades in combat. He opened a drawer and withdrew a photograph, sliding it across the desk toward her. Colette picked it up and felt her breath catch. The photograph showed two young soldiers in jungle fatigues, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincibility of youth. One of them was clearly a younger version of Colonel Whitfield. The other was a man Colette had never seen, but somehow recognized. He had her eyes. That photograph was taken in Panama in 1989, Whitfield said. The man standing next to me was Sergeant First Class Emmanuel Adebayo. Your uncle. Colette stared at the photograph, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. Her mother had never mentioned a brother, never spoken of any family in the military. The Adebayo name had always been just hers and her mother's, a small family of two against the world. Emmanuel was the finest operator I ever served with, Whitfield continued. He had a gift that I have only seen once since. The ability to read situations before they unfolded, to see what others could not see. The words echoed in Colette's memory. They say you see what cannot be seen. We served together for 6 years, Whitfield said. 12 deployments. He saved my life more times than I can count. His voice grew heavy, and on his 32nd mission, he gave his life to save mine. Colette felt tears forming but did not let them fall. Tell me. Whitfield's eyes grew distant, seeing a jungle that existed only in memory. We were compromised during an extraction. Enemy forces had us pinned. I took a round in the leg and could not move. Emmanuel could have made it to the helicopter. Instead, he came back for me, carried me 200 meters under fire. He got me to the bird, but he took 3 rounds doing it. The colonel's voice cracked. He died in my arms before we cleared the trees. Colette looked at the photograph through blurring vision. Her uncle, a man she had never known, a legacy she had never been told existed. Why did my mother never tell me? The pain was too great. Whitfield leaned forward. Emmanuel was her older brother. He raised her after their parents died. When he was killed, something in her broke. She left Louisiana, changed her life, tried to bury the grief by never speaking of him again. And you, Colette said, you have been watching me since Fort Bragg. Whitfield nodded. When I saw the name Adebayo on a selection roster, I had to know. And when I observed you during training, when I watched you read situations the way Emmanuel did, I understood that his gift had not died with him. It had passed to you. Colette sat in silence, absorbing the weight of revelation. Her entire life recontextualized in a single conversation. The abilities she had attributed to waitressing had deeper roots than she ever imagined. Your mother was right, Whitfield said softly. She told Emmanuel before his last deployment that her daughter would do something important one day. She made him promise to watch over you if anything happened to her. He paused. He never got the chance to keep that promise. But I did. You have been watching over me, Colette said. All this time, from a distance. Whitfield smiled sadly. Emmanuel would have wanted me to let you find your own way. He always said the best operators were forged, not manufactured. He looked at her with something like pride. 31 missions. 0 casualties. You surpassed your uncle's record. You became something he would have been proud of. Colette finally let the tears fall. For the uncle she never knew. For the mother who had carried that grief in silence. For the legacy that had shaped her without her knowledge. Thank you for telling me, she managed. Whitfield stood and moved around the desk, placing a hand on her shoulder. The ceremony tomorrow will honor what you accomplished in Syria. But I wanted you to know that you carry something older. Something that connects you to a history of service and sacrifice that began long before you put on this uniform. Colette rose and faced him, her composure returning. I wish I had known him. You did. Whitfield squeezed her shoulder gently. Every time you read a room, every time you see what others miss, every time you bring your people home alive, that is Emmanuel living through you. He released her and moved toward the door. Get some rest, Staff Sergeant. Tomorrow is your day. Colette left the office carrying the photograph he had given her. She walked across Fort Bragg to the small memorial garden where soldiers went to remember those who had not come home. Okoye was waiting for her there, as if he had known she would need someone. "He told you," Okoye said, "about your uncle." Colette looked at him sharply. "You knew." "I suspected." Okoye moved to stand beside her. "Whitfield mentioned Emmanuel Adebayo to me years ago. When I saw your name, when I watched you operate, I began to wonder. Why did you not tell me?" "Because it was not my story to tell." Okoye looked at the memorial wall, the names of the fallen carved in stone. "And because you needed to become who you are on your own terms. Not as Emmanuel's niece, as Colette Adebayo, the woman who led 31 missions with 0 casualties." Colette placed a photograph in her pocket, next to the worn image of her mother she had carried through every mission. "Tomorrow they pin a medal on me," she said, "for something I did not even know I was carrying. That is usually how legacies work." Okoye smiled gently. "The people who came before us shape who we become, whether we know it or not. What matters is what we do with the gift they left behind." Colette looked at the memorial wall and imagined her uncle's name carved among the honored dead. "I will make him proud," she said quietly. "I will make all of them proud." The parade field at Fort Bragg stretched out under a cloudless Carolina sky, filled with soldiers standing in formation. Colette had seen ceremonies before, but never one where she stood at the center. 200 soldiers, officers and enlisted, veterans of deployments spanning every conflict of the past 2 decades. They had assembled to witness something that had become the talk of Special Operations Command. The commendation of Staff Sergeant Colette Adebayo, the former waitress who had led 31 combat missions without losing a single operator. Colette stood at attention before the reviewing stand, her uniform immaculate, her medals reflecting the morning sun. In the front row of the formation, she could see the faces of those who had shaped her journey. Captain Vance, Master Sergeant Okoye, Wheeler, Tran, Kowalski, Dubois, the team that had followed her into hell and come back whole, and Hollister, standing at attention with the others, his expression unreadable. Colonel Whitfield stepped to the microphone, his presence commanding the attention of every soldier present. "We gather today to recognize extraordinary service," Whitfield began. "To honor a soldier who exemplifies the highest traditions of the United States Army and the Special Operations community." He paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the assembly. Staff Sergeant Colette Adebayo arrived at selection with a background that many considered disqualifying. She had no military legacy, no prestigious training pipeline. Her previous occupation was listed as waitress. A ripple of reaction passed through the formation. Colette kept her eyes fixed forward. What her detractors did not understand, Whitfield continued, was that Staff Sergeant Adebayo had spent 7 years developing skills that cannot be taught in any military school. The ability to read human behavior under pressure. The capacity to manage chaos with calm precision. The instinct to see threats before they materialize. She learned these skills serving customers in a Louisiana truck stop, and she applied them to save American lives in Syria. The colonel lifted a citation from the podium. "For exceptional leadership during 31 combat operations, resulting in 0 friendly casualties. For tactical innovation that neutralized enemy forces while minimizing collateral damage. For personal courage under fire that directly saved the lives of multiple team members." Staff Sergeant Adebayo is awarded the Bronze Star with Valor Device. Whitfield descended from the podium and approached Colette. As he pinned the medal to her chest, he leaned close enough to whisper, "Emmanuel would be proud. Your mother was right about you." Colette felt tears threatening, but held them back through sheer will. "Thank you, sir." Whitfield stepped back and returned to the podium. "Captain Vance, please share your observations." Vance moved to the microphone with the confident bearing of a combat commander who had seen everything the battlefield could offer. She looked at Colette for a long moment before speaking. "I have led soldiers for 18 years. I have served with operators who came from West Point and operators who came from the streets. I have learned that background tells you very little about who will perform when lives are on the line." She paused. "Staff Sergeant Adebayo is the finest tactical leader I have ever observed. Her ability to read the battlefield saved lives on every single mission. Her compassion for her team created loyalty that cannot be commanded, only earned. Her record speaks for itself, but the numbers do not capture what she truly accomplished. Vance turned to face the formation directly. She taught us that excellence can come from anywhere, that the skills we dismiss as ordinary can become extraordinary when applied with dedication and purpose. She made us better by challenging our assumptions about who belongs in this community. Vance stepped back. A moment of silence hung over the parade field. Then Hollister moved. He stepped forward from his position in the formation, breaking protocol in a way that drew every eye. He marched to a position facing Colette and stopped at attention. "Permission to speak, Colonel," Hollister said. Whitfield studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Granted." Hollister turned to face the assembled soldiers, his voice carrying across the parade field. "When Staff Sergeant Adebayo arrived at selection, I made it my personal mission to break her." He let the admission hang in the air. "I looked at her background and decided she did not belong. I mocked her. I sabotaged her. I did everything in my power to make her fail." The formation had gone utterly still. This was not part of any ceremony they had witnessed before. "I was wrong." Hollister's voice cracked slightly. "Staff Sergeant Adebayo is not just a competent operator. She is the best leader I have served under in 22 years. She sees what the rest of us miss. She makes decisions under pressure that save lives. And when I made a mistake that should have killed me, she risked her own life to save mine." He turned to face Colette directly. "I spent months calling you a waitress like it was an insult. But the truth is, everything that makes you exceptional came from those years carrying plates and reading dangerous customers. You did not succeed despite your background. You succeeded because of it." Hollister snapped to attention and rendered a salute that held more respect than any words could convey. "I was wrong about you, Staff Sergeant. The United States Army is lucky to have you." Colette returned the salute, her throat tight with emotion. The parade field erupted in applause that rolled across the formation like thunder. When the ceremony concluded, Colette was surrounded by well-wishers. Officers she had never met wanted to shake her hand. Soldiers asked for photographs. The recognition was overwhelming, and she found herself longing for the quiet anonymity of a truck stop diner. She finally escaped to the chow hall, seeking a few moments of peace before the reception that would follow. The building was nearly empty in the mid-morning lull, just a few soldiers scattered at tables with late breakfasts. Colette collected a cup of coffee and found a table in the corner. She pulled out the two photographs she now carried everywhere. Her mother's worn image, her uncle's young face beside a younger Whitfield. Two people who had shaped her without her knowledge, whose legacy she now carried forward. "Excuse me, Staff Sergeant?" Colette looked up. A young female soldier stood beside her table, nervous energy radiating from every line of her body. She wore the insignia of a private first class, fresh from training, her uniform still carrying the stiffness of someone who had not yet worn it into comfort. "I am sorry to bother you," the young soldier said, "but I watched the ceremony. I heard what they said about your background." She hesitated. "I used to work at a grocery store before I enlisted. People keep telling me I do not have what it takes for this. That I should have gone to college first, done ROTC, built a real foundation." Colette gestured to the seat across from her. "What is your name, Private?" "Reyes, Mom. Private First Class Maria Reyes." "Sit down, Private Reyes." The young soldier sat, her hands folded on the table like a student awaiting instruction. Colette studied her for a moment, seeing echoes of herself in the uncertainty and determination that warred in the young woman's eyes. "Let me tell you something that took me a long time to understand," Colette said. "The skills you build in hard places become the skills that save lives in harder places. Every difficult customer you handled, every crisis you managed, every moment you stayed calm when everything was falling apart. Those experiences shaped you in ways that matter. But how do I prove that to people who only see my background?" "You do not prove it with words." Colette leaned forward. "You prove it by being excellent, by outworking everyone who doubts you, by letting your performance speak so loudly that they cannot ignore it. She smiled. And you find the people who see your potential and let them help you grow. Private Reyes nodded slowly, absorbing the advice. Is that what you did? Colette thought about Okoye, about Whitfield, about everyone who had believed in her when others dismissed her as a waitress playing soldier. I found people who saw what I could become, not just what I had been. She picked up her coffee and took a sip. The military is full of people who will underestimate you, Private. Let them. Their doubt becomes your advantage when you exceed every expectation they set. Reyes straightened in her chair, something hardening in her expression. Thank you, Staff Sergeant. I needed to hear that. Colette smiled and pushed her chair back. Come on, Private. Let me buy you breakfast and tell you about the time I talked down an armed robber with nothing but a coffee pot and a calm voice. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let us know your favorite part, or tell us about someone you know whose background others underestimated before they proved everyone wrong. The two soldiers walked toward the serving line together, the chain of mentorship continuing. Behind them, morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Fort Bragg, illuminating a future that belonged to everyone willing to earn it. Colette Adebayo had started her journey carrying plates in a Louisiana truck stop. She had ended it carrying the hopes of everyone who had ever been told they did not belong. And somewhere, she knew her mother was smiling.